So I'll give a bit of an introduction about myself. My name is Chunda McCain. I'm one of the founders of a protocol called Ion Protocol. We do kind of risk analysis for consensus layer state, and then also so things like liquid staking providers and the like. And then we also do the same thing for kind of middleware solutions at scale on restaking platforms. And then the idea is we actually utilize these frameworks to build financial primitives on top. But we'll go a little bit more into that on the latter part of this presentation. To start, I want to give context about what I'm talking about here. So risks within restaking. The idea is we're going to kind of walk through the incentive structures behind all of the stakeholders in restaking platforms. And thinking on the basis of these incentive structures, how we can make sure that they're aligned to mitigate the propagation of endogenous risk in restaking platforms. So let's get started. Quick overview of kind of the general cadence here. I think the first thing that's great to start with is actually setting the context behind restaking's value proposition. A lot of people understand restaking from kind of like the simple user flow and like, okay, I stake some capital, middleware solutions generate revenue, and then on the basis of this revenue, restakers get to earn yield, and you have these like node operators and so on and so forth. But I wanted to take a step back and kind of look at what is the core value proposition that restaking platforms serve? And on the basis of this core value proposition, how can we kind of think about how all these stakeholders fit into kind of that core value proposition? And so right after that, I'm going to go over kind of looking into each of the three main stakeholders you'll find present in pretty much every implementation of a restaking platform. The specific kind of motivations and the effect of these motivations of various different types of stakeholders on restaking platforms. Then I'm going to go a little bit more into what I think are some exogenous kind of accelerants for the dynamics that exist between the stakeholders in like a restaking platform that don't really fit in super cleanly with one stakeholder or the other. And then finally, going a little bit to talk about some kind of potential ideas for solution, kind of what we're tackling at Ion, and some potential other avenues to explore from there. So let's get started. So like I said before, really want to contextualize restaking from kind of a core value proposition standpoint. And I really think there are two things that restaking does and does pretty effectively. And so one of those things is the idea of decreasing the cost of capital of security. So if you are, a traditional proof of stake system, you want to bootstrap a validator set, there's a lot of exogenous costs that come with actually bootstrapping that validator set, right? You need to bootstrap the emissions. If you're running proof of stake system, you need to get people to actually hold your asset, which usually requires some incentivization. You need to get infrastructure providers in the door, and you usually need to lobby them for that, or provide some kind of subsidies or rebates for that. And all in all, we haven't even gotten to the process of actually emitting your assets to your users, of which there's a huge opportunity cost, because effectively it's either I'm staking my collateral, or let's say my USD denominated collateral, in your proof of stake system or another one's. There's really no doubling up here. And so restaking platforms kind of turn this dynamic on its head and say, instead of kind of doing this, I delegate capital here or I delegate capital somewhere else, it utilizes the idea of kind of leveraging the pre-existing capital you have, usually in a non-native asset. So for example, like if I'm spinning up a middleware DA solution, but I'm restaking with ETH, that's like the non-native asset. I'm going to use this non-native asset to kind of bootstrap the security. And what that does is decrease the opportunity cost for users. And by decreasing the opportunity cost for users, you effectively decrease the kind of cost overhead from the middleware perspective, right? Because the middleware now doesn't have to subsidize that opportunity cost for the user. The kind of second thing is a bit more looser, which is the idea of restaking platforms allow kind of for easier discovery. You get to spend less on human capital in order to access infrastructure providers, in order to access kind of capital in order to access kind of users that can connect you between the capital infrastructure providers and can kind of manage those strategies. Usually you would have to kind of do all that effort yourself, but now, it's just like, if you're a homeowner and this is Airbnb, you just kind of list your system on a platform, and it's a lot cheaper and a lot easier and a lot quicker to source that liquidity. So that's the first value proposition. The second is this idea of enabling pooled security. So what is this idea of pooled security? Effectively, there's a cost of corruption to any proof of stake system. When we think about things like Ethereum, right, the cost of corruption usually we kind of quantify in a 51% attack. The economics of that are slightly different on Ethereum just because of its scale, but you can pretty much extend that to any like smaller instance of a proof of stake. I got to move that around. Proof of stake system. And what restaking platforms do really well is they kind of turn this idea on its head and say, like, okay, instead of kind of isolating the value of security in these various different kind of pockets of different proof of stake systems, let's actually just aggregate it in kind of a shared security model where all of these systems can effectively, or all of these different services can effectively share the same pool of capital, right? And this idea of enabling pooled security does kind of a piece of what I talked about before, like decreasing the opportunity cost for restakers, but also at the same point offers middleware services more security for lesser cost, or for the same cost as before. And so these are what I believe to be kind of the two core value propositions of restaking platforms that really allow them to make sense for all the players involved. And now let's kind of walk through who those players are. So in contextualizing the stakeholders, there's three main kind of stakeholders you'll see in pretty much every restaking platform. Now, you can introduce different kinds of stakeholders with different implementation decisions on different restaking platforms, but in every one, you'll probably see these three. So the first are node operators. These are the people who run the hardware instances of ABSs or middleware solutions. These are the people who usually are running pre-existing enterprise infrastructure companies, running nodes for, who knows how many proof of stake systems. And you can introduce them, or the restaking platform introduces them into kind of this open source marketplace in order for them to gain access to more opportunities. Next, you have middleware services. These are the kind of lifeblood of the ecosystem. They're the ones who want this access to security, and they want to bootstrap adoption for the product with, kind of as minimal cost as possible. And then finally, we have the restakers. The restakers are the ones who are aiming to leverage this pre-existing stake capital, in the case of ETH staking, although really you could abstract it away for any asset, to earn additional revenue by lending access to the security underlying these assets that they hold. And to kind of put into context, and the reason why I kind of want to go through the value proposition of restaking platforms holistically is when we look at each of these three stakeholders, we realize that restaking platforms offer a benefit to pretty much each of them in the form of the two things I mentioned before. For node operators, right, you increase discoverability, decrease the cost of them actually, if you're a new one bootstrapping kind of a node operator company, being able to reach out to various different middleware services, that discoverability is a lot easier. And then the cost analysis is a lot easier as well because you're playing in that open marketplace. You also can incentivize lighter client support and like lighter hardware instance support. For middleware services, I think, they obviously get the biggest benefit that I mentioned before, because all of those value propositions are basically focused around middleware services. And for restakers, people who are sourcing revenue from a pre-existing proof of stake system, let's say Ethereum, you're able to kind of leverage this capital because you're decreasing that cost of capital on the AVS side or on the middleware side. They effectively distribute that additional kind of margin or a margin on that additional revenue to you as a user. So now that we've kind of set the stage, we know the value proposition of restaking platforms, we kind of understand the stakeholders holistically, want to dive in a little bit more into each one of these stakeholders and understanding like what are the motivations of the stakeholder in their position in a restaking platform, and how does that actually motivate their decision making as a part of a restaking ecosystem. So let's start with the node operator. So I like to call node operators effectively what I call like on-chain attributable AWS. You can think of them as basically cloud infrastructure providers, right? As long as there's like they're B2B SaaS companies which have kind of infrastructure demands from middleware services, these kind of like products, in order to perform some arbitrary compute function. And users are effectively delegating capital to them in order to kind of gain access to the underlying revenues of whatever compute function that they're required to manage. Their motivations are focusing on scaling as aggressively as possible. There's one constraint on a node operator to not scale. That constraint is that node operators effectively need to support any type of middleware service that where the revenue supersedes the cost of capital of running that additional hardware instance, or running, let's say, multiple hardware instances at scale. And so when you think about it that way, right, the underlying effect of this is that node operators want to expand as aggressively and as kind of widely as possible in a restaking platform for all middleware that satisfy that constraint. And, you know, you can kind of get some second order effects I'm sure people are thinking about here. Things such as node operator centralization might be something to pay attention to. But I think the one thing that is lesser talked about that is really interesting to kind of think about is that node operators don't have to put up any collateral of their own. Node operators inherently aren't taking on any really sort of execution risk outside of identity risk in supporting another AVS or another kind of middleware solution outside of, like, say, if they're running their own validator. And so as a byproduct of that, you kind of get a slight principal agent problem with node operators. And the second order effect of that is that node operators inherently are pretty risk insensitive when it comes to supporting middleware. And when it comes to supporting middleware at scale, they'll try to do so as aggressively as possible. And if there's a tremendous amount of opacity around kind of the risk assumptions of various different middleware solutions, this can propagate to kind of negative effects for restakers, because restakers may not understand kind of the risk assumptions of the platforms that they're entering into. And also for middleware solutions, there's no real guarantee for node operators outside of identity risk. And if you're an undoxed node operator, that really doesn't exist, for them to kind of act as performant as possible. You kind of get actually a situation where you just need to be just as performant as possible to stay in the system, and not kind of exit the system by whatever arbitrary benchmark that exists. But you're really not incentivized to go anywhere further beyond that, because at the end of the day, you're simply looking to expand your capabilities as far as possible to support as many AVSs as possible that satisfy your constraint to generate revenue. So that's the node operator. The next is kind of the middleware provider. These are the lifeblood of restaking platforms. These products are those solutions that serve some kind of external demand in the ecosystem, whether it be DA, bridges, oracles, locational attestations, you name it, and transfer the value of that revenue plus some kind of equity premium to restakers. Their motivation, and I'm going to go a little bit into restakers in a second, but they're really the only one here which doesn't really have an infinite payoff function. They're looking to constrain their costs as much as possible. There is no, I'm motivated to kind of accept as much capital as possible because now I dilute my yields. There is no, I want to kind of expand the amount of hardware instances I need to provide because that increases the cost of capital of those hardware instances. I'm inspired to effectively provide or gather as much security as possible for as low cost as possible. And so I kind of call them the bottleneck, right? In the restaker ecosystem, these kind of middleware providers are the bottleneck to capital growth and are the ones that dictate effectively where revenue sits between the other kind of players in the ecosystem. And as a byproduct, right, you kind of have exogenous demand from all the other kind of stakeholders in the ecosystem, whereas these are trying to be as conservative as possible. So you kind of have a push-pull on demand supply here. And I think an interesting constraint is if we see in architecture decisions for restaking platforms, the ability for middleware solutions to constrain the amount of capital that's actually delegated to them in order to kind of have a more predictable cost of capital for the security. We're going to see some interesting market dynamics on how does capital delegation work? Are we going to see the opening of things like FIFO queues for entry into restaking platforms or entry into specific middleware solutions? Are we going to see competition or the sale of access to AVSs and AVS yield? All of these questions are yet kind of unanswered based on design decisions, but are things that we should be kind of focusing on and thinking about when it comes to how the market dynamics are going to pay out as a byproduct of these ecosystem providers. Last thing is the restaker. I kind of think of them as like LPs to a managed fund of an ETF of various different kind of revenue generating services. Restakers basically allocate capital and delegate to these infrastructure or strategy managers and are really optimizing and create a portfolio where they maximize their risk reward, right? I want to maximize the amount of reward I generate while minimizing the underlying risk framework for slashing. And the thing that I want to kind of bring up here is at the progeny of restaking platforms, you're going to have a lot of opacity around kind of what are the actual implied risks for restaking? What are the actual implied risks for certain middleware frameworks? Do we actually know kind of what the constraints on slashing is going to look like for, let's say, new DA solutions, locational attestation? These are networks and these are products and services we've never tested before. And if this slashing risk is considered negligible or opaque by the general market for sentiment reasons, which is kind of the indication so far, I think the motivation of restakers is to effectively delegate to node operators that support as many middleware solutions as possible. As a byproduct, at the genesis of restaking platforms, we may see the initial middleware solutions that exist completely define the risk profile of restaking platforms when they initiate, because effectively you're going to be socializing that risk among all the ecosystem players in that platform. And so with those kind of like three different ecosystem providers, there are kind of two last exogenous kind of things that add on to this dynamic. The idea that the ability for anti-slashers to scale for different middleware solutions is very difficult, and I can go a little bit more into that later because I'm running out of time. But also that the idea of, if we think about this opacity of risk, and then we think about the emergence of things like liquid restaking providers, people who manage this capital delegation, well, liquid restaking providers in an opaque market also compound this risk and abstract it further for consumers. And these are all things that we really need to consider in the future of kind of restaking platforms, because in the end, although we believe in the commodification of security, in order to kind of really assure that it's going to be here for the long run, we have to think about how we're kind of analyzing this risk. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you.